Welcome to Mrbeefys Can of Pop News, or Beefy's Pop, whatever you want to call it. Either way, we're here to cover all kinds of pop culture news, whether it's comic book news, horror, video games, movies, who knows. Some good, some bad, some happy, some sad. Anyways, let's get on to the video. James Gunn, Zack Snyder, both of them have their hands in the DC cookie jar, and we've got to talk about what they've done, what they're doing, and which one is really going to be the best for these characters. And right off the bat, everybody's going to say Snyder, but we got to look more into this, okay? First off, we got to acknowledge that Snyder has been dropping a lot of tweets and a lot of pictures lately. He was just on the WB lot, and for some reason he was welcomed back with like a hero's reception, is what this article is claiming. I don't know where he fucking went. I mean, he's always been doing movies, but let's get into this. First, we're going to talk about the reasons what makes Zack Snyder a poor fit for DC movies. So the first thing we're going to talk about is his version of DC was extremely dark. Not just dark for DC, but like dark. Snyder tends to favor bleak, serious, visually heavy storytelling. That can work for characters like Batman, but it becomes more problematic when applied to more characters broadly overall. For example, Superman traditionally has a strong association with hope, optimism, and inspiration. Snyder's Superman is much more conflicted and somber, which some audiences, including myself, felt it missed an important part of the character. And number two, he emphasized visuals over character development. Snyder is exceptionally strong at cinematography, composition, action sequences, and creating striking imagery. There's no denying that. All of his movies, from Dawn of the Dead, Army of the Dead, just everything, Watchmen 300. The criticism is that his movies sometimes prioritize spectacle and mythology over natural character development and dialogue. The best example? Batman vs. Superman. It introduces enormous ideas. Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, Lex Luthor. It sets up the Justice League, but has to juggle so many concepts that some characters don't receive enough development. Batman and Superman were unusually cynical. One of the biggest controversies was his interpretation of Batman. His Batman is older, brutal, and willing to kill or use extremely violent methods. That's a legitimate interpretation, but fans felt it moved too far away from the traditional ideas of Batman as someone who has a strict moral line and code. And I get it, he was aiming for like the Dark Knight Returns Batman, I get that, but still, even that Batman wasn't this brutal. We could also look at Superman's journey. It was built around uncertainty and alienation rather than immediately embracing his role as Earth's inspirational hero. I stopped counting, but this is like number 4. He wasn't necessarily the right person to build an entire cinematic universe. And this may be the biggest issue. Snyder's strengths are arguably better suited to individual large-scale films than managing a massive, interconnected franchise involving radically different tones. DC needed filmmakers capable of making Superman inspirational, Batman dark and grounded, Wonder Woman mythological, Aquaman adventurous, The Flash comedic and energetic, and Green Lantern science fiction oriented. Trying to make all those characters feel like they belong to one Snyder style universe created tonal problems. The fifth reason, I feel like a lot of people, it can go either way how you want to look at it and how you feel like these movies should be done, but the movies could be too dependent on comic book mythology. Snyder clearly loves DC Comics and often incorporates obscure comic book imagery and references, just like, The Dark Knight Returns, the little quick images we got of that. That's great for hardcore fans, but casual audiences don't necessarily know the mythology like, Darkseid, Nightmare, Mother Boxes, Apocalypse, or various alternate realities. A successful cinematic universe needs to work for someone who has never read a DC comic. And as a huge comic book fan, I can understand that. Like, I love the little nods, but not everything has to be, an homage or an exact recreation of the comic. Sometimes there needs to be an adaptation. The sixth reason is his storytelling can be overtly complicated. Snyder frequently tells stories through symbolism, foreshadowing, dreams, flashbacks, religious imagery, and visual parallels. That can make his movies interesting to analyze, but it can also make them feel less accessible. Batman vs. Superman is probably the clearest example. There's a lot happening beneath the surface, but the audiences who weren't interested in unpacking all of it could simply find the story confusing or boring. And this last part is just purely opinion, but his fan base became part of the fucking problem. The intense debate surrounding the Snyder era became extremely polarized. You essentially ended up with Snyder is the visionary and the studio ruined his movies versus Snyder fundamentally misunderstood DC. That kind of environment makes objective discussion difficult and puts enormous pressure on DC to continue or abandon his vision. But with all that being said, Snyder absolutely has strengths. It's important not to reduce this to Snyder is a bad director. He has genuine strengths like excellent visual composition, strong sense of scale, memorable action imagery, willingness to take big creative risk, deep knowledge of comic book aesthetics, and a distinctive filmmaking identity. Like his Watchmen 300, the Justice League Snyder Cut, demonstrate why he has such a dedicated following. I feel like he would be great for DC to a point, but not to be fully in control and, decide every move. Now for James Gunn. The strongest criticism isn't that he's a bad filmmaker, it's that his particular strengths and style may not fit every corner of the DC universe. Now let's go through a list of his problems with the whole thing. Number 1, his comedic style can overpower serious characters. And damn, did that showed so hard. Gunn is strongly associated with irreverent humor, absurd situations, and characters constantly making jokes. That worked extremely well for Guardians of the Galaxy and the Suicide Squad. The concerns is that not every DC character benefits from that approach. Batman, Superman, Green Lantern, or the more serious Justice League stories can lose some dramatic weight if humor is constantly inserted into them. Number 2, he can make characters feel too similar. Gunn has a recognizable character formula. There is no denying that. You can tell in every movie that he's done in the superhero genre. Damaged outsiders, eccentric personalities, dysfunctional groups, and characters who use humor to hide emotional pain. That's one of his strengths, but if applied too broadly, then DC could start feeling like everything is a James Gunn movie. A cinematic universe needs different filmmakers with different voices. Number 3, his version of DC may lean too heavily into the weird. Gunn clearly enjoys the stranger side of comic books. We got Groot, Raccoon, and now in the DC universe, we got fucking Terrific, Guy Gardner, which I love Guy Gardner. He's one of my favorite characters. And I'm hoping with Gunn, we'll get some more goofy characters along with Metamorpho or, like Badge. He teased Badge. That's valuable because DC has plenty of bizarre characters, but there's a potential downside. If too much emphasis is placed on obscure and comedic characters, mainstream characters could become secondary to the universe's eccentricity. For example, Superman doesn't necessarily need to be surrounded by bizarre characters for the movie to be interesting. Superman in his own right has a lot of deep, rich lore to go off of. Now, number 4, his previous success doesn't guarantee Superman's success, gave Gunn considerable credibility with superhero audiences. But Superman is fundamentally different from those properties. Superman is one of the most recognizable fictional characters in history and carries decades of expectations about heroism, morality, optimism, and inspiration. Successfully writing Rocket Raccoon or Peacemaker doesn't automatically mean someone will get Superman right. Number 5, his humor can undermine emotional moments. Gunn often uses jokes immediately before or after serious material. That can make his movies entertaining, but some viewers may feel that humor prevents emotional moments from having enough time to breathe and settle. For a character like Superman, sincerity can be just as important as humor. Number 6, the DC universe could become too dependent on Gunn's personal vision. This is probably the biggest criticism. DC has an enormous variety of tones, and this is what we were saying about Snyder. Batman is like crime, noir. Superman, hopeful science fiction. Wonder Woman, mythology. Green Lantern, cosmic science fiction. Swamp Thing, horror. The Question, detective mystery. Aquaman, fantasy adventure. Clayface, horror. Like, we have so many characters with so much rich history, and they're so uniquely different. If Gunn's comedic and eccentric style becomes the dominant identity of DC, some of those characters could lose what makes them distinctive. Number 7. Gunn's DC is inevitably going to be compared with Marvel, because Gunn spent years working for Marvel. There's always going to be the temptation to compare his DC work to the MCU. Some people may worry that DC could start feeling like Marvel with DC characters, rather than developing its own identity, which in my opinion, the Blue Beetle movie started to feel like a Marvel movie. Number 8. A connected universe creates different challenges. Gunn is very good at building an ensemble around unusual characters, but running an entire interconnected franchise requires balancing dozens of characters, filmmakers, tones, actors, continuity, and audience expectations. That's a considerably different challenge from directing 1 or 2 movies. Though the same things that could make Gunn a questionable choice are also potentially his biggest advantages. He understands character-driven superhero stories, knows how to make obscure comic characters interesting, and has demonstrated that he can balance comedy with genuine emotion. So the strongest criticism isn't James Gunn can't make good DC movies, it's James Gunn's filmmaking style could become too dominant for a universe that needs many different tones and creative voices. Those are honestly the most fairest arguments against either one of them, and they're very similar, but the difference, in my opinion, is that Gunn has had a better, connection with his characters and the audience compared to Zack Snyder. Zack Snyder's fan base is just really, really loud and dominant. That's what that is. But if you went to core comic book heads, a lot of them would probably lean towards Gunn being more accurate than Zack Snyder. Now, let's look at their actual performance in the box office. This is where everybody's going to initially think Snyder is the best choice. But let's look at this and think about these movies. So Zack Snyder's first movie in the DC universe was The Man of Steel, featuring Henry Cavill as Superman in 2013. This was the first Superman movie that we've had since Superman Returns in 2006. And The Man of Steel had a lot of hype building up to it. There were a lot of promotional stuff going on, and I think there was like a shaving thing with Kevin Smith and a lot of other people. And I think Bill Nye and Neil deGrasse Tyson. Either way, what I'm getting at was there was a good build up and hype for that movie. It was the first one in 7 years or so. So that in my opinion is what drove a lot of people to the seats, to the theaters. The biggest criticism of Man of Steel was that Snyder and Goyer presented Superman way too dark, conflicted, and destructive compared with the traditionally hopeful and inspirational version of the character. The biggest criticism? Superman kills Zod. Before that and during that, there's way too much destruction. Superman wasn't very inspirational, if inspirational in any point at all in the movie. I'm trying to think of a point, but I can't think of a single one. The movie also was overly serious. There was very little humor, and tonally, it was just dark. On top of it being too dark, there was also way too much action, where it seemed like majority of the movie was just an action set piece. The character of Clark Kent was also very limited. His whole development was limited, and the relationship with his dad was just terrible. There was that one scene where his dad recommended that he lets the children in the bus, drown basically. That was his Superman, everybody, in case you forgot. It grossed $668 million, half a bill, a little over half a bill. The next movie was Batman vs. Superman: Dawn of Justice. Now, this movie also had a lot of things teased going in, so there was a lot of hype that was built up before the movie even came out, which once again, I believe drove the people into the seats, and that's how come it had a huge drop off the following week. Most superhero movies have a drop off the next week or so. That's normal, but the DC ones were significant. So this movie, it introduced all the Justice League, basically. Doomsday. It did the Death of Superman story arc. It did a lot. And there was a lot of criticism in this movie. We got to see how brutal the Batman was going to be in this universe. And then we also got to see the weird interpretation of Lex Luthor. People were not vibing with that. And after that, it looked a little gloomy. The movie made bank. But was it good enough that it deserved a sequel? No, not really. That all being said, though, the next movie to come up was Suicide Squad. Once again, this movie had something with the hype that built it up. The movie did horribly with like the reviews and ratings and even like fan reactions. But it was marketed as like a villain superhero movie. The first one, Marvel was supposed to have Thunderbolts out a while before, but they never got to it. So DC dropped Suicide Squad, the first villain team up movie. Everybody wanted to see that. They even put Joker all throughout the marketing. The Joker was shown, doing scenes that we didn't get. David S. Goyer, he says that he has a longer version of it that might get released if Snyder gets back control. But they falsely misled a lot of people. So that movie falsely hit $749 million. Next up is Wonder Woman 2017. This movie was a lot more justifiable. This was a good movie all around, except for the last act. The last act of the movie was really, really bad, but that came to be a thing for all superhero movies, or for most of them. Bad third acts. Almost majority of them had bad ones. But Wonder Woman was a solid movie. It was the first Wonder Woman movie, and it was the second or third live-action incarnation we had of the character. So there was a lot of good word going behind it. The movie also did good with critics and with fans. It was a solid film, and it grossed $824 million. So right up there, Wonder Woman alone did Batman v Superman, aka Justice League .5. But after Wonder Woman, we ended up getting Justice League, the Whedon cut. Yeah, it was Joss Whedon's cut. It started off with Zack Snyder, but he had a tragic issue with his daughter. She ended up passing, and Whedon took over, and Whedon tried to Marvelify it, and it just didn't work because of the previous movies. The tones were so dark and brooding. It got canned by critics and fans. Surprisingly, it brought in $661 million. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that, for one, it was the first live-action Justice League movie. And for two, you had Joss Whedon taking over. And by this point, everybody was pretty sour on Zack Snyder's vision. Then in 2018, we get Aquaman. Much like Wonder Woman, this was the first live-action Aquaman movie. And it was so different from all the other ones with the director James Wan. Visually, it was a nice movie. It looked good, and it was way more uplifting and optimistic than anything that Snyder had put out previously. So Aquaman had a lot riding on. And despite being a joke character for so many years, once Jason Momoa portrayed the character, he started getting a lot more credibility. His portrayal of the character also helped carry this movie. It was a great success. There's no denying that. $1.1 billion, that's a good movie. Though, like I was saying earlier, the third half, it felt a little weak. And there were certain scenes where the CG just weren't good. Now we get to Shazam. This is where things start changing, and the bad reception and the dark tones of Zack Snyder's previous universe starts really taking into effect. Yes, we've had Aquaman and Wonder Woman, two great movies that were visually different from the Snyderverse. And from those two movies is why they tried to make Shazam deliberately just way different from anything from the Snyderverse. And it was inspired by movies like Big. And this character was a character that needed to be reintroduced to the public, despite him having a presence in the media in the past. And a lot of people thought and seen this as a major overcorrecting from the criticism of Batman vs. Superman and Justice League. Instead of establishing a consistent DC identity, the studio seemed to be trying different formulas after reestablishing a pretty set tone and look from the Snyderverse. And after this movie is when they start going all over the place with tones and visuals. And you can definitely tell from Shazam to Wonder Woman 1984 to Black Adam all the way up until the sequel to Shazam. Now, James Gunn has been introduced into this universe before this point with his The Suicide Squad. But up until then, he wasn't in charge, he wasn't ahead of it, but he was linked around August of 2022 to a new Superman movie, separate from the Man of Steel continuity. In October of 2022 is whenever they officially announced Gunn and Saffron was taking over, and the old DCU was basically dying out. And this, in my opinion, is what really helped drive the abysmal sales and performance of these last 3 or 4 movies in this universe, being Black Adam, Shazam, Fury of the Gods, The Flash, and Blue Beetle being the last one in this universe before Gunn officially sets it off with the Superman movie of 2025. But what this has definitely shown us here was it started off strong with all the hype and the potential of this universe. But then once we actually seen what Snyder was doing with it, how dark it was, how different it was, over time it soured not just the audience but the critics. And whenever Warner Brothers intervened and tried to do major course corrections and, change all the shit that people was hating, that's whenever they lost full control of this. The worldwide numbers of the Snyderverse movies were about $7 to $8 billion over the course of 15 movies. And out of those movies, the one that hit the $1 billion mark was the one that Zack Snyder wasn't even involved with, and that was Aquaman. And if we go and look at the audience reception to the Snyderverse movies, they were generally about 70%. That's the average of them all. The 2 biggest ones being in the 80s was Black Adam at 85% and Wonder Woman at 83%. Once again, 2 projects that had no involvement by Zack Snyder. Now, let's look at James Gunn's movies. Now, he only has 2 under the DC umbrella at this moment. One of them actually being, hands-on with. The second one, not so much. So, Superman came out in 2025. It had a budget of $225 million. It brought in worldwide box office of $618. After that, with digital sales and merch, it hit around $800 million. So a little shy of $1 billion. But that was a single solo Superman movie by James Gunn, and it was on par with Zack Snyder's Man of Steel. And now if we look at the reception of it, the Superman 2025 movie by Gunn is currently sitting at 90% on the popcorn meter on Rotten Tomatoes with a 83% tomato meter. At one point, Superman reached a 95% audience score, higher than Zack Snyder's Justice League at 92%. Then we got Supergirl that just recently came out a month and a half ago, 2 months ago, and it is doing horrible. It's the reason that we're even talking about this. But the fucked up thing about this, okay, the budget 170, the worldwide box office 125, with digital sales and merch, they probably just barely got the budget. So the movie did bad. But there was a handful of Marvel movies that did equally as bad, and that didn't destroy a whole universe. So I don't understand how this one movie is going to cause, Gunn's whole vision to come to an end. And now, if we compare the two, James Gunn, Zack Snyder, we'll go through this in categories. Critical reception, James Gunn, clearly stronger. Snyder, divisive. There's no doubt about that. Audience reception, generally, James Gunn, pretty strong, pretty favored. Even in the Marvel side, everything he done, a lot of people mostly loved. Zack Snyder, strong, but more polarized. It's hard to disagree with that one because he's so different. Now, consistency. Gunn, though people might not like the humor and the lightheartedness that he always interjects in it, it is way more consistent. Though if we look at Zack Snyder, his consistency is a lot more uneven. And when it comes to building a gigantic universe with multiple characters, there need to be some kind of consistency. And aside from Watchmen and Zack Snyder's Justice League, what other strong comic book movies or comic book style movies has Zack Snyder done successfully? James Gunn, he's done superhero, he's done The Guardians, The Suicide Squad, Brightburn. So he's been in there a lot longer and touched way more characters than Snyder. And they've all had a pretty consistent feel, and they've all had a pretty well-received reception or well-received score. Just going by what Gunn has directed, his films landed much better with critics and fans. Guardians of the Galaxy is at 91%. The Suicide Squad, 90%. Guardians 2, 85%. Volume 3, 82%. Superman, 83%. Snyder has some very liked movies, but his filmography has a much more wider spread. Dawn of the Dead, 77%. Watchmen, 64%. 300, 60%. Man of Steel, 56%. Batman vs. Superman, 28%. Sucker Punch, 23%. And then Rebel Moon, 16%. The thing that carries Zack Snyder is his loud, passionate fan base. But if we just go by all of the numbers and the records, Snyder is not the savior to the DC universe like everybody is thinking he is. Gunn wins on reception and consistency, no doubt. Snyder wins in terms of having a more distinctive, polarizing style and passionate fans. Snyder is a good director. I love his movies. I watch a lot of them, and for a lot of my life, a few of his movies were like in my top 5 greatest films of all time. And that's because I'm a really big fan of Watchmen and Dawn of the Dead and stuff like that. But as a fan of comic books and all that, I will acknowledge he is not the best pick for DC comic movies. Some characters he can pull off, some he's a great fit for, but overall, I believe James Gunn is ultimately the better pick for the long term if we just look deeper into it. But let me know below, what do you guys think? The video is coming to an end. Thank you once again for giving me your time, and thank you for the comments and everything else. As usual, have a great day. It's all about attitude. There is no progress without struggle, so stay in there. I've been your host, Mr. Beefy, and you've all been fantastic.
Sit back and listen to the